Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Richard Gephardt, and I've had the honor of serving as the chair of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy for these last 3.5 years. And it's my honor to welcome all of you to this gorgeous place in this wonderful setting for this very important meeting. I want to start by thanking two of our co-sponsoring organizations here today and recognize two people who are the head of these organizations. First, the president of the Ronald Reagan Foundation, Executive Director, John Hybush. John, would you please stand and be recognized? And John, I just want to say I've been in many of the presidential library facilities. This is the most spectacular, and it's very well done. Congratulations on all you've done. Our third co-sponsor is the Pacific Council on International Policy, and its president, Gerald Green, is here. Gerald Green. So as we heard last night, and as we all know, in part we are commemorating the 30th anniversary of Ronald Reagan's speech at Fulton, Missouri, at Westminster College, where Ronald Reagan, with the great help of George Schultz, laid the foundation for the National Endowment for Democracy. And I must tell all of you that as chair of this board, I am constantly, deeply inspired by many of the what I call heroes of democracy that I have met and that we all met a few minutes ago in that forum, who constantly put their lives on the line to achieve democracy in their countries. I have a saying: democracy is a substitute for violence. And the trouble is, in many places, violence comes back, and violence is exercised against people like the four we saw a few minutes ago, who are willing to risk their very lives for freedom for themselves and for their fellow citizens. So it's this struggle for freedom that all of us and all of us at the NED are honored every day to support. It is now my pleasure to call on our great president, Carl Gershman, to make a presentation. Carl?
I too want to join Dick in praising the speakers at the morning's conference, Madeleine Albright and Alejandro Toledo, and then especially the four activists who explained so clearly what the struggle is all about. We're gathered here on this coming Friday, June 8th, is the 30th anniversary of the Westminster Address, the great speech that President Reagan gave 30 years ago to the British Parliament. And in that speech, he spoke of communism ending up on the ash heap of history, but he also spoke about what would happen after dictatorial regimes fell and the importance of building democratic institutions. And he spoke about it in the speech. And of course, we're commemorating this because that speech launched the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy. And the four people who spoke this morning on the panel that was just concluded, Miroslava Gongadze from Ukraine, Birtakan Mideksa from Ethiopia, Radwan Masmoudi, who's originally from Tunisia, now a Tunisian American, and Xiao Chang from China. I don't think, frankly, that I've heard a clearer discussion in all the time I've been at the NED, and it's been a while now, a clearer discussion of those two themes. What motivates people to struggle for freedom, and then why and how it is so difficult to build democratic institutions once the dictator is brought down. And we're seeing this all over today, especially in the Middle East. We'll see it in Burma. Democracy is a very difficult process. This is what Madeleine Albright has been saying. It's what Secretary Schultz has been saying during the course of this conference. Ned wanted to take the opportunity of our being together at the Reagan Library on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the Westminster Address to say thank you to Chris Cox, who recently retired from the NED board after the maximum 9 years of active service. Chris remained an active and dedicated NED board member despite his heavy responsibilities as a member of Congress for more than 16 years, and later as the chairman of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. NED was the only board on which he served during those years, and he did so because of his deep commitment to NED's mission of supporting democracy throughout the world. He demonstrated this commitment when he served as the senior associate counsel to President Reagan in the Reagan White House, and later in the Congress, where he served for more than 16 years. And as a new member in 1989, he befriended two dissidents, the Hungarian Arpad Gunz and the Lithuanian Vytautas Landsbergis, both of whom soon were to become presidents of their respective countries. The night that Landsbergis was elected the first president of liberated Lithuania, he went out to the Vilnius airport to greet Chris Cox, who arrived too late to observe the election because the Soviet Union had tried to block his transit, his departure from East Berlin. And he embraced Cox on the tarmac. And Chris Cox was later awarded the Order of Gediminas, which is the highest honor that the Republic of Lithuania can give to a living non-citizen. And when he was on the NED board, Chris paid special attention to the efforts by NED grantees in China to circumvent the great firewall of internet censorship. We heard about that this morning from Xiao Chang. And he frequently invited NED grantees from all regions to make presentations before the House Republican Policy Committee, which he chaired. Later, when he was SEC chairman, he sent a videotape message to the Moscow Conference of the Other Russia, a meeting that was held just before the G8 summit in St. Petersburg in 2006 that brought together hundreds of Russian Democrats, including the chess champion Garry Kasparov and the soon-to-be martyred journalist Anna Politkovskaya. He connected his own work at the SEC to their concerns, explaining the reliance of successful free markets and economic growth on shareholder democracy, independent regulation, and what he called freedom in all its meanings, including particularly the freedom to say, write, publish, broadcast, and think the truth as one understands it without fear of persecution. And I was at that conference in Moscow in 2006, and I can attest that his message was received with enormous enthusiasm. Chris Cox has devoted his whole life to advancing freedom as the bedrock of democracy and human dignity. For his commitment to these values and his service to the cause of democracy, NED is proud to present him with an original woodcut entitled Light, Fire, and Democracy. It's a bold and striking image of the goddess of democracy, the iconic statue that was erected in Tiananmen Square in 1989. Now, yesterday was the 23rd anniversary of the massacre at Tiananmen Square when that statue was raised. But that statue really lives on, inspiring people not only in China but all over the world as a symbol of democracy. It's what we give every year. The NED gives as its Democracy Award. When we have events in the U.S. Congress, we give the statue of the goddess of democracy. I might note, by the way, that yesterday the Shanghai Stock Exchange lost 64.89 points. 6 June, 4 June 4th, 89. I swear, it lost 64.89, and it started, and I kid you not, this is some coincidence. I don't know where these coincidences come from. The market opened at 2346.98, 23rd anniversary, and then take the last four numbers backwards. 98 is 89, and then 46 is 64. That happened yesterday. So Tiananmen Square, this symbol still remains relevant. I want to call Chris up to receive this. This is the woodcut of the goddess of democracy, and we hope it'll remind him of everything that he stands for. Thank you.
That's a great story. I just would like to say thank you, and also that I was at a Chinese restaurant over the weekend, and I had a fortune cookie, and it had numbers written on it. And when I unscrambled them, it was the address of this presidential library. And so that's how I found myself here. Thank you very much for those kind words. To be here in the presence of Secretary Schultz, Bob Tuttle, so many people that as a mezzanine level staffer in the Reagan White House I came to admire and respect, not to mention to be in these hallowed halls with President Reagan, to be here with Majority Leader Dick Gephardt, with whom it was my privilege to serve, and so many people here. Sean Walsh, who is my partner at Bingham, who also worked in the White House. I just wish my wife Rebecca was here, because she spent a fair amount of time on this airplane with President Reagan as well. Thank you to everyone who continues the work of the NED. The NED was enormously meaningful to President Reagan, of course, but it has been bipartisan in its inception. It is bipartisan in its DNA. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party in the United States are the two liveliest and most significant political movements, but there are others, and NED speaks for all of us. Abroad, speaks for all of us here at home in so many important ways. I've never had a better professional experience than the service, Carl, that I had with you and so many others here on the NED board. It is a fabulous contribution to freedom in the world. I'm inspired today by what I've heard, and I'm inspired to keep listening. So thank you very much for letting me be a part of this.
I'm sure you're still enjoying your lunch, but we have a great treat ahead of us in the next few minutes. To introduce George Schultz, I want to call on one of our board members at NED, who I'm sure many of you know, Bob Tuttle. Some years ago, I was in Russia that had just come out of the Soviet Union, and I was meeting with one of their young parliamentarians who was a fighter for democracy in Russia. And I asked him what he thought the biggest problem in Russia was at that time. And I thought he'd say that their economy was messed up, or they didn't have any money or jobs or whatever. And he said something that really kind of surprised me. He said, the biggest problem in Russia is that we don't have citizens yet. And it really stopped me short, and I began to think about how wise and important that statement was. And I began to think about the great ingredient that we have in our society here in the United States, in that we have such great citizens who take responsibility to do all the things that citizens have to do to make democracy work. Bob Tuttle is one of our greatest citizens. You all know of his background in so many endeavors here in California and in other places. He was our ambassador to Great Britain during the Bush administration. He participated in the Reagan administration in important assignments. And walking into this gorgeous room in this enormously beautiful setting, as I walked in with him, he was telling me how they got this airplane in here and built this fabulous glass edifice so that people could see out and see in. And then a few minutes later, someone associated with the library told me that the funds that were needed to build this were raised by Bob Tuttle and a lot of probably people in the room and other great American citizens. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to present a board member of NED that I'm very proud to present, Bob Tuttle.
Thank you, Dick, for that over-generous introduction. And I'm just thrilled today. I really can't think of a greater honor, and not to mention a personal privilege, than to having been asked to present this afternoon's speaker. I think you all know that George Schultz is a man of great accomplishment. He served his country in multiple roles, and the lists of department he headed during his distinguished career, I think, is unmatched. But let me repeat them. Secretary of Labor, Secretary of the Treasury, Head of Department of Management and Budget, and of course, Secretary of State. And in all these positions, he served with great integrity and great distinction. But even more for me, and what continues to impress and amaze me, is how he has refused to rest on his laurels. And just as one example, he has played a leadership role in the campaign to fulfill President Reagan's dream of eliminating all nuclear weapons. That's just one of the many things he does. And in January 1989, after receiving the Medal of Freedom, he returned to Stanford and to the Hoover Institution, where he is the Thomas W. and Susan B. Ford Distinguished Fellow. But guess what? He goes to work every single day. Now, George, I hope that doesn't include Saturday and Sundays for Charlotte's, but I know he's down at Hoover every single day working. And those of you, like myself, who were fortunate enough to be at last night's dinner, where he received the NED's Distinguished Service Medal and participated in a discussion with the other recipient, Secretary Albright, know how thoughtful he is approaching issues of foreign policy and how deeply committed he is to the cause of freedom that was so dear to Ronald Reagan. In addition to his many other positions, he has been on the board of the Reagan Foundation for many, many years, and it's a pleasure that to be part of that board and to serve with him is a real honor. So please join me in welcoming one of America's great servants and great citizens, George Schultz.
Thank you very much, Bob. I always love to come to the Reagan Library. And as I always do, I come in the door and I walk to Ronald Reagan's final resting place. And I remember how he used to talk about the West and the endless horizons and the importance of having endless horizons, of having vision. And you look there, he picked that site, and you look at that view, it's the endless horizon. Then you wander around in the library. Right now, to a certain extent, we have the Queen's 60th event. So I looked at some pictures in his study, and there are a lot of pictures of him with the Queen. And he loved to tell stories. And I remember one he told, he was in Windsor Castle with the Queen, and the two of them were to walk down this aisle with people on each side to greet them. And he was waiting for her to start. And she looked up at him, and she said, "You are standing on my dress." Now, Ronald Reagan loved to tell that story, and it was about a 5-minute story when he told you. He loved stories. And he also had the idea of what was really important about stories. I remember once I was asked to give a speech announcing and explaining a reasonably important foreign policy decision he'd made. So I wrote the speech out very carefully, and I had these twice-a-week private meetings with him. I took it over. I said, "You asked me to do this, and I've written this speech out, and would you take a look at it to be sure it's okay?" So he took it, and he leafed through, and he said, "It's perfect." It was a kind of a dead silence. He said, "Of course, if I was doing it, I wouldn't do it this way." And he said, "You've written this speech to be read, and it'll probably be reprinted in the New York Times and your bulletin, and that's appropriate, that's good, but I give a speech to people who are in front of me or at the other end of a television, and that's different." And he took the thing back and he flipped it at random, and for 3 or 4 minutes or so, he was a skillful editor, he edited it, and then he put a little caret and he put story. And I looked at it, and I could see that he had very skillfully personalized the speech. Then I said, what's the story for? He said, "Well, that point that you're making there is clear enough, but it's a little abstract. And I have found that if you want to get a point across to people, you tell them a story that they can imagine themselves in, because they not only get it in their head, they get it in their gut. And it's only when they get it in their gut that you really get the point across." So I want to start with a little story from the speech that people have been referring to, because it illustrates this point and makes another. He says in the so-called Westminster speech, he says, it reminds me of the elderly lady whose home was bombed in the Blitz. As the rescuers moved about, they found a bottle of brandy she'd stored behind the staircase, which was all that was left standing. And since she was barely conscious, one of the workers pulled the cork to give her a taste of it. She came around immediately and said, "Here now, there now, put it back. That's for emergencies." "Well," he went on, "well, the emergency is behind us, is upon us. Let us be shy no longer. Let us go to our strength. Let us offer hope. Let us tell the world that a new age is not only possible, but probable." Now, I think that was the essence of a lot of the foreign policy thinking that we've been discussing. If you say to yourself, what constitutes democracy? Well, I would submit to you it's a combination of things. There is the rule of law. There is respect for human dignity. There is an open economy. There is freedom of expression. There are all of these things, not just going someplace and voting, although that's important. All of these things go together and are very important. So let me tell a few stories that illustrate Ronald Reagan's deep commitment to human rights that's shown in this and many other things. During World War II, he was an Air Force officer, and his basic assignment was to get films that were films from the front and edit them down and make them into something that could be shown to the top brass and give them a special insight into what was going on. So he told me one day that he's getting these films, and he comes across a film of the initial film of one of the Holocaust camps. So he got that up for showing. And he said, I thought this was so terrible, so almost unimaginable that any human beings could do this to other human beings, that nobody in the end would believe it ever happened. So I said, I kept a copy of the film for myself, so that if any time somebody was in a discussion with me and they doubted the Holocaust, I would pull this film out and show it to them. It was a depth of commitment. And last night I told a story, I'll repeat it briefly, of an incident in early 1983. I had just come back from a well-publicized trip to China, and I had landed at Andrews Air Force Base. It was snowing. It had been snowing all day. I was lucky to land. It snowed all night, Saturday morning. And the Reagans were stuck in the White House for the weekend. They couldn't go up to Camp David or anything. So our phone rings, and Nancy says, why don't you come on over for supper? So my wife and I go over. And we sat there, and all of a sudden they're asking me about the Chinese leaders. What were they like as people? It was interesting. He drove staff people crazy because he'd be getting ready to have a meeting with some visiting dignitary, and they'd have all these staff papers for things he's supposed to ask. And he didn't pay too much attention to them because always, in his view, he wanted to size up this person. What was this person like? Did he have any sense of humor? What kind of backbone? How will he be as a human being to deal with? So they're asking me about the different Chinese leaders. Then they knew that earlier as Secretary of Treasury, I had dealt with Soviet leaders. So they started asking me about the Soviet leaders, and mostly they were still there. And I talked about them. And gradually it dawned on me, this man with all the rhetoric has never had a real lengthy meeting with a big-time communist leader. And he's dying to have one, contrary to all the reports. So I had gotten permission to have once-a-week meetings with Ambassador Brennan, and the idea was to clear away little things that were irritants. We didn't need unnecessary irritants. So I said, next Tuesday I have a meeting with Brennan. What if I bring him over to him and you can talk to him? So he said, fine. He said, it'll only be about 10 minutes because all I want to say is his new leader, Andropov, had just become the Secretary General in Russia and Soviet Union. If his new leader is interested in a constructive dialogue, I'm ready. It'll only take me about 10 minutes. So I said, fine, I'll bring him over, whatever you want. So we go over. We're there about an hour and a half. We discussed everything under the sun. But at least a third of the time, Ronald Reagan spent on human rights, on Soviet Jewry. And they kept coming back to the Pentecostals who had rushed into our embassy during the Carter administration. They were still there. It's just like a big neon sign saying you don't treat people decently. You won't let them worship as they want. You won't let them immigrate. And he kept coming back and coming back to the human rights issues. Interesting, his first meeting with a big-time guy like that and human rights was very prominent in the discussion. So as we're going back to the State Department, Brennan says, well, why don't we make that our little issue? So we worked on it, cables back and forth. And finally I had a document. I took it over to the president. I said, well, any lawyer can tell you can drive a truck through the holes in this document, but I have to believe with all the background that if we persuade the Pentecostals to leave the embassy, they will be treated okay, allowed to go home, and probably allowed to emigrate. So we did that. And he had kept saying in a discussion with Dobrynin, says, I just want to see the results. I'd like to see them out. I'd like to see these human rights problems straightened out. And you won't hear a word from me. I just want to see it happen. So they went out. They weren't allowed to go home. In about 2 months, they were allowed to emigrate. Not only the ones who were in the embassy, but their families, about 60 people. And I said to the president, the deal is, we'll let them out if you don't crow. And he never said a word. Can you imagine the temptation for a politician to say, look what I did? And it showed, in a way, the depth and sincerity he attached to these issues. So I think the building of a human rights record, and as he said in the quote that I read out to you, a willingness to speak up and let people know that somebody understands their plight and is interested in it and supports them. We heard from many, many Soviet dissidents when they got out, like Sharansky, for instance. And you ask him, well, what made the difference? He said, well, I remember that evil empire speech. That made all the difference to us because we heard, somebody gets it. And I remember how shocked people were when Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire. And my friend Paul Nitze, a wonderful, great man, really, one of the greatest, served in Democratic and Republican administrations. I was lucky enough to have him serving with me. And he was testifying before a Senate committee, and they were after him about the evil empire business. And finally, one of the senators said to him, Paul, how can you serve in an administration where the president would say that the Soviet Union is an evil empire? And Paul said, Senator, have you considered the possibility that the statement might be accurate? That was the end of the hearing. But he was never afraid to say the truth. But also, he was careful. Because when people are objecting, to a certain extent, you can say they know what they're objecting to, but they don't really know what they're for. In the Middle East right now, they know what they're objecting to, but they don't have any experience, most of them, with what you do once you win and how you put something together. So you need to be careful. You need to build the blocks. And so my principal message here is that the mission of the National Endowment for Democracy is never more important than right now. Because with the depth of the information and communication revolution, people everywhere can find out most everything they need if they will take a little trouble. And they can also organize. They can communicate with each other. It used to be that the powers that be had more or less a monopoly on information and a monopoly on ability to organize. That's not true anymore, anywhere. And we're seeing the result, not only in the Middle East, but in Russia and China, everywhere. It's something new. So what it is providing is example after example of places where it's obvious people know what they're against and they want to get rid of it. But then what are they for? How is something going to be substituted for that? And that's where the National Endowment comes into play, because it has the experience and has given the thought to the kind of building blocks that need to be put in place. Sometimes you can put them all into place at once. Sometimes you have to build them carefully over time. It isn't necessarily the right thing. The first thing you do is have an election before people know what they're doing. So I say on this occasion, particularly proudly, that Ronald Reagan espoused the creation of the National Endowment, that it was all done on a totally bipartisan basis right from the start and today. It's American. And it's also reached out, and there are all sorts of, I believe, international chapters or whatever you might call them of other countries pooling intelligence, pooling experiences, different countries having avenues into different countries and so on. And I think this is a moment in the history of the world where things have opened up in an unprecedented way almost everywhere. And it's going to be really tremendously important that we be able to help people not only to know what they're against, but to identify what they're for and how to implement it. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The Secretary has agreed to take a few questions, and I think we have a roving mic, so just raise your hand, and as always, keep your question brief. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Secretary Schultz, about your message. My name is Simon Simonian. I'm interested in collaboration. And how much collaboration are you thinking of in building a democratic society in a place where they don't have that experience, like in Tunisia, for example?
Democracy where the countries involved don't have much experience, which is to say the people in the country don't have much experience. Well, that's what NET is all about. So I should ask you to come and answer that question. But my approach to it would be, first of all, let people know where we stand. That here is something important, here is something liberating for individuals, and something that can work, and there are countless examples of it. And the examples are not culture-bound. There are examples in very different kinds of cultures that work, and they have their own peculiar ways of working. So you've got to work out something that is suitable to your own circumstances. But I think it needs to start with the establishment of the rule of law, the establishment of reasonable respect for other human beings and their points of view, willingness to argue, tolerate. And that is hard to come by after you've overturned somebody. But you need to get in and emphasize those things. And there is this sort of urge that democracy is about electing somebody. And so that tends to happen. And it's important to try to surround that process with enough time, enough educational experience to make the voting really meaningful. So, but it's a hard process. I would say in the Middle East right now, looking at it broadly, if I were doing it, I would be saying to myself, well, Tunisia and Morocco offer examples of places that have begun to gel something. And we need to be helping them. They're probably willing to listen. And with Tunisia, they are no doubt struggling with refugees from Libya, so we can help with that, so that gives you a seat at the table to a certain extent. So you do those things and hope that those two countries can look like examples. Then we have Iraq. Iraq seems to be tenuous. Nevertheless, I think it's important for us to do everything we can to see that Iraq remains a country that has reasonably representative government. They have all the capacity to be a wealthy economic unit. So let's think about that carefully. Then you have Syria. And to me, we've got to be bolder. We've got to let the people in Syria that are protesting know we're on their side. We understand why they don't like what's been happening to them. That doesn't mean we put boots on the ground. I might say in the Ronald Reagan period, we only used force 3 times. And we only put boots on the ground once. That was in Grenada, and we were in and out of there. I might say that one of the times we used force had to do with Iran, and a little more of this could be helpful with Iran. The Iranians were messing around with Kuwaiti shipping of oil from Kuwait. So, and Dick, you'll remember this. We reflagged the Kuwaiti ships to our flag. Congress was heavily consulted, and it was an American initiative. And while the president of Iran was in the United Nations making a speech saying the last thing Iran would do would be to put a mine in the Persian Gulf, our Navy was taking pictures of them doing it. And we boarded the ship, took off mines for evidence, took off the sailors, sank the ship, took the sailors to Dubai, and said to Iran, come and get your sailors and cut it out. So that was a building block. It sent a message that was clear. No lives were lost in that operation, none. So it worked out. So I think there are all kinds of things like that that we should be doing. And with Syria, we should certainly be letting the people know we understand their problem. And we've had trouble over the last decade with Turkey. But isn't this an opportunity to say, look, the Turks are trying to establish zones where people can go and be safe, and maybe be places where they can organize themselves. So why aren't we saying to the Turks, hooray, we're with you, we'll help, we'll provide some resources. That's a way of not only saying, that's the way of putting your money where your mouth is to a certain extent, without committing troops on the ground. We don't need troops on the ground, we've got them, they're Syrian troops. So I'm just sort of rambling on here about the kinds of things that you have to do, and it's cut and fit, it's opportunistic to a certain extent, but nevertheless, having in mind the ingredients that you need to get put into place. Is that okay for an answer, Carl?
We'll take one more question. Got a microphone.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, you're one of the greatest Americans in our history, and I want to thank you. The question I have for you
You're
is...
setting me up.
Admittedly, so don't strike when I ask my question, please. But here's my question. The tensions between Tel Aviv and Tehran seem to be escalating quite rapidly. I would love to know, if you had your old job back, what would you like to see done differently?
The tensions between
Tel Aviv and Iran. If you were secretary, what would you do?
Well, first of all, the Israelis have a lot of reason to feel tense about it, because Iran is clearly wanting to get to a nuclear weapon. I don't have the slightest doubt in my mind about that. Whether they will get there remains to be seen, but that's what they want. And they say about 5 times a day that they want to wipe Israel out. So a nuclear weapon would give them the ability to do it. So if you're an Israeli, that's got to worry you, right? And that's understandable. So what should we be doing? Well, I think that the military threat is credible. It's important to keep it that way. Just where we stand in Iran's program, I'm not sure, I'm not privy to any intelligence, but they're moving. They are enriching uranium. They're enriching it to a 20% grade. If you can get to 20%, you can readily, easily go to 90%, which is what you need for a weapon. And an enriched uranium nuclear weapon is relatively easy. So the physicists tell me. The Hiroshima bomb was an enriched uranium bomb. It was never even tested because they were so sure it would work. So I believe we should be confronting Iran a little bit more forcefully. And sanctions are one thing, But Iran is guilty of egregious acts of violent attack against us and our enemies. The most recent one is an effort to assassinate the Saudi ambassador on American soil. So what do? Nothing. We indict some people who are in Iran. Lots of luck. That's nothing. We need to figure out how to strike back and make them pay a penalty. They are part of arming Hezbollah, which is sitting there with rocketry all aimed at Israel and Hamas, our ally and friend. You got to say, when are we going to get them to stop getting away with that kind of stuff? And why are we hesitating with Syria? Assad is in bed with Iran, and he's the channel for a lot of this armament going. So we got to step up to that. In other words, I'm saying there's something between sanctions, which are, I don't know how effective, and an all-out attack on nuclear. There is a legitimate self-defense actions that can be taken, like the one I described in the mining of the Gulf in the case of the Kuwaiti shipping. And when they see that there's something specific being done, they pay attention. They paid attention after that incident. They paid attention all of a sudden when we were, the initial success we had in Afghanistan and Iraq, all of a sudden Iran changed its tune. And as the success wore off, they changed back again. So I think we have to step up a little bit more firmly and be willing to negotiate, but as Ronald Reagan said all the time, you negotiate, but you negotiate from strength. If you go to the table and you don't have strength, you're going to get your head handed to you. So we got to have the strength and then use that at the bargaining table to get what we want. Well, let me say, just in closing here, since you said that was the last question, how great it is to be here and to have this celebration of the National Endowment for Democracy take place in Ronald Reagan's home here, since he had a lot to do with getting this started, but also at a time when the world is awash in change as almost never before. So the opportunity for doing something constructive has never been greater. The difficulties are clear, but the opportunity is immense. And the National Endowment for Democracy will be one of our principal ways of getting there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I agree with the gentleman who asked the last question. We've just had the privilege of listening to one of the great Americans. And I would encourage you on your way out today to go to the adjacent building up to the Reagan-Gorbachev galleries to see what was a complete surprise to Secretary Schultz that was organized by Mrs. Schultz and John Heybush and the generosity of the Bechtel organization. The Reagan-Gorbachev galleries are now dedicated to Secretary Schultz, and there's just a marvelous plaque that says, anyway, go visit it. And just, it occurred to me listening here today, it just happened serendipitously that I happen to be on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy and the Reagan Foundation and the board of the Pacific Council. So I didn't ask Carl Gershman or Jerry Green or John Heybush, but I'm going to invite you all back 10 years from now to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Westminster speech. So, and if they won't pay, I'll write a check for lunch for you then. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to the participants. This concludes the conference. It was just fantastic. Thanks for everyone, and thank you, Secretary.